My name is Eric Winans. I'm the Research Farm Manager and Technical Agronomist for Brant Discovery and Innovation. With planting season right around the corner, this is an excellent time to take a look back at some of the planting date data that we've collected at the Research Farm over the past several years. So in 2023, we planted both corn and soybean. Our first planting date went in the ground on March 30th. And then every 2 weeks after that, we had a subsequent planting date. So we went all the way out to our last planting date on May 11th. So we had 4 different planting dates for both corn and soybean. We're also looking at responses to agronomic management within those planting dates. So we'll look at response to ammonium thiosulfate or starter fertilizer. So in 2023, with that first crop going in the ground on March 30th, we had pretty cool and wet conditions right around that time of planting. And actually, for those first couple planting dates on soybean, we had some decent frost on the cotyledons. A couple different times the air temperature dropped below 30 degrees there at the research farm at the start of April. But when we look back at the data, we actually saw that, especially when we were using ammonium thiosulfate at planting, we maximized yield in corn on that March 30th planting date, 278.6 bushels. And then that yield decrease from delaying planting all the way out to May 11th was a 50 bushel swing. We lost yield by 50 bushels by delaying planting out to May 11th. So when we look back at all the data over the last several years at the research farm, what I've done is I've standardized those yields. So I put them all in terms of percent of maximum yield. So the highest yield in a given year would be 100% of maximum yield. And then if it decreased yield by a certain increment, then that would be a lower percent of maximum yield. But when we look at those graphs, we always get these questions, should I be planting my corn first or my soybean first? But actually they decrease yield as you delay planting at almost the exact same rate. But overall, as we look at both the corn and soybean and how they decrease yield as we delay planting, we're right around 95% of maximum yield potential for planting by that last week of April for both crops. We're at about 90% of maximum yield potential if we're planting by that first week of May. And then we're all the way down to 80% of maximum yield potential if we're delaying planting all the way out to that last week of May. So the data is really pointed towards, if you're debating on what crop to plant first, really if you could plant both crops first, that's going to be most ideal. But as we're sitting here today and we're thinking about when should we pull that trigger and put some seed in the ground, there's a couple things we're really looking for. One is that 50-degree soil temp. We want to make sure average soil temp is 50 degrees and above. And then we want to make sure we have a warming trend or a warming pattern in the forecast for the next few days. Really, that first 24 to 48 hours is most critical, because that first drink of water that corn seed or that soybean seed brings in needs to be a warm temperature. If it's below 50 degrees, that's when imbibition chilling injury can occur, and that can decrease our final stand. So another thing that we really take a hard look at the research farm is, looking at applying nutrition with the planter at the time of planting, especially if we're planting, on those early planting dates. Even if we have really good soil organic matter or good soil fertility levels in our soil, that nutrition isn't always mineralized. That process of mineralization is mediated by temperature. And if we're planting into cooler soils, a lot of times that nutrition isn't quite mineralized and available to the crop. And so we can, through the use of starter fertilizers or planter box applications, supply key nutrition right there next to that crop row that it can, take advantage of as it comes off those seed reserves and that seedling's beginning to shoot those roots out and look for nutrition. In each one of our planting dates on corn this year, we applied ammonium thiosulfate at 10 gallons to the acre, and we saw that greatest yield increase from that ammonium thiosulfate application on that first planting date. Now, it was up to a 40 bushel response. Now, I don't think that's purely just a sulfur response. I think it's also, there's a lot of utility to ammonium thiosulfate. It's very acidic. It's lowering that pH of that band and that zone of application along that crop row, which is helping us release a lot of these other elements. It could be phosphorus bound with calcium, or zinc that's bound to the negatively charged soil, and releasing that, jump starting that mineralization process earlier in that season while the soils are still cool. The key to getting this response to sulfur early season is, really comes back to that fertilizer source. And we're using ammonium thiosulfate, one, because it's acidic, and two, It utilizes both sulfate sulfur and elemental sulfur. That sulfate sulfur is immediately available for crop uptake. So as soon as we apply that and that crop is beginning to go through its vegetative growth stages, that sulfur is immediately available for crop uptake. The problem with elemental sulfur is it needs to oxidize, and that's mediated by soil temperature. So, we get a lot of questions of, hey, I can't put ammonium thiosulfate out with my planter, or I don't have the time to do it in the spring. Can I just use elemental sulfur in the fall? Well, the real problem with that is one, we can't, as we sit, in the wintertime or the fall, predict how much of that elemental sulfur will oxidize over the coming season. But we do know, because it's mediated by temperature, the majority of that sulfur is going to become available around June and August, when soil temps are the warmest. And at that point, we're already mineralizing sulfur that's already in our soils, and we've missed that mark in terms of when we can be most responsive to that sulfur application. So all in all, when we look back over the data from 2023 and past years, we've seen that we really maximize yield by planting early. We're allowing ourselves to utilize that entire growing season. By planting early, we're getting that crop out of the ground earlier, and we're reaching that point of maximum light interception earlier in that growing season, which has a huge impact on our final yield. But it's also really important to make sure that the soil conditions are right for dropping that seed in the ground. And another big decision that we make at planting is the use of that ammonium thiosulfate, especially when we're planting at those earlier dates. That had a large impact on yield for us in 2023.